So I did a video about whether or not you could actually buy a business with no money down, and got a lot of feedback and comments and likes and dislikes on the video. And then I got this email from Cody, who believes that he's figured out a way to buy a business with no money of his own. We're going to take a look at it and see if it makes sense. Hey there everyone, it's David Barnett from the investlocalbook.com blog site, where I talk about buying and selling businesses, local investing, personal finance, small business management, and anything else that people want to ask me about. Today I've got an email message from Cody. It was actually a reply to my buy a business with no money down video that was on YouTube. And it's a really great, thoughtful response, and I wanted to reply to it in a video. So Cody thanks me for the videos. He says, I have a question. I've heard of people buying businesses through 100% financing, but not technically no money down. First, they go to a lender and borrow against the assets of the business or raise cash, which they then give some or all the cash to the seller as a down payment. Then they get the vendor to carry some kind of financing on the rest. The seller's in a junior position to the lender in case of a business failure. In theory, this should work great. The seller will get about as much cash at closing as they would if they liquidated. Plus, the seller has a lot of upside with the vendor financing. For the buyer, it's great because they get in with little of their own capital and etc. And then he basically asks if I've ever heard of this, does it work? And if it does work, is it easy to put together? And if it does not work, why not? So let's address each of those one by one. But first of all, I want to address the notion that we're actually talking about buying a business here, because a business is a collection of assets, including capital, which is in the form of inventory, machinery, operating capital, etc., people who actually do the work, and a place to conduct the business. And those things work together to produce a cash flow. And if the cash flow's value, according to the risk in the industry, exceeds the value of the assets in the business, then we're going to end up with what is called goodwill. So for example, if a business does, let's say it's a restaurant, a pizzeria, does $150,000 a year in seller's discretionary earnings, so that's cash flow to the owner, and you agree to buy that business for, let's say, $230,000 or $240,000. If the business only has $100,000 of tangible assets, then we've got $130,000 to $140,000 of goodwill in the business. So in Cody's question, he talks about using the value of the assets to borrow and the seller receiving more than he would in a liquidation. So if you were going to go to the bank in that pizzeria scenario and you had $100,000 worth of equipment and you said, Mr. Banker, I'd like to borrow money, at the most, in most parts of the world, they're going to be looking at between $50,000 and $80,000, depending on the rules where you are. But they're not going to finance 100% of used restaurant equipment, right? Or used equipment in any scenario, in any kind of business. They're not going to finance 100%. They're going to finance up to a certain amount. And in some areas where there are government guarantee programs, maybe it's going to get higher, 75 to 80%, for example. So in this scenario that Cody's talking about, we're talking about a business essentially selling for little to no goodwill value on top of the value of the assets. So what has to be, what you have to be careful about in this kind of scenario is that we're probably talking about a business that maybe isn't really profitable, or the earnings, the seller's discretionary earnings, are equivalent to the fair market wage of what the owner would be earning if they did this work for somebody else's company, for example. So we may not actually be talking about buying a business here. We're talking about buying a job, or more specifically, talking about buying a collection of assets, okay? So some stuff, some material, some equipment, some machinery. Does it work? Yeah, it does, except if you're trying to do this for the first time. Here's what I mean. If you are a person with a job and you have some money in the bank and you want to do this kind of procedure to buy a business, to get into business for the first time, the banker who looks at your proposal is going to want what's called an opening balance sheet. So on the opening balance sheet, they're going to have their debt that they're going to lend you. They're going to consider the vendor take-back financing that the vendor's going to get you, and then they're going to consider your own equity. And they're going to have minimum debt to equity ratio requirements. So for example, 3-to-1. So if they see that you're putting together the bank debt and the vendor financing, let's say on a $100,000 purchase, and that debt totals $75,000, they're going to want to see you putting in $25,000 of your own money for a 3-to-1 debt to equity. $3 of debt for every $1 of equity. Okay, so that doesn't circumvent your requirement to be putting money into the company. It may mean that you're going to put money in for operating capital, which I addressed in the first video. Remember, I said that people will sell, stuff absent the proper inventory, working capital, etc. So this could be a scenario like that. It doesn't mean you're going to get 100% financing on this business. You're still going to have to put money in, but you may be able to use a technique like this to get financing on the hard, tangible assets you're acquiring to basically start a new business. Now, where does this kind of scenario work really well? It works really well if you're already in business. So, there's an expression that, there's a couple of expressions, the rich get richer and the poor stay poor, or the first million is your hardest. If you're already in business and you want to acquire another business using a program such as what Cody suggests, then it's easy because the banker's not going to look at an opening balance sheet for a new business. He's going to look at a forecasted balance sheet for the business you have after this acquisition has taken place. So if your current business has a good amount of equity and a strong debt to equity ratio, then you could potentially take on more debt and add more assets to your balance sheet without crossing the minimum debt to equity threshold. And you could do this, right? So people who are already in business, that have a profitable business that has accumulated equity in the form of retained earnings, can sometimes have equity on the balance sheet sufficient to expand their balance sheet through a program like this, okay? If it does work, is it easy to put together? Like I said, it's easier to put together if you're already in business than if you're trying to start a new business. And if it does not work, why not? Essentially, we're talking about buying a collection of assets, not necessarily buying a profitable, mature, successful business, which of course is the least riskiest type of business to buy because you can be certain that there's going to be sales, profits, etc. If I ran into someone who had a business for sale and they were willing to sell it to me for close to the value of the assets, then I would be assuming that there wasn't much in the way of profitability in that business beyond just a fair market wage for the owner manager. And in fact, it could be one of those scenarios where it's a money losing business. The guy isn't taking a fair wage out of the business, so it even falls lower in my rankings of economic activity from owning a job to owning a hobby. Anyway, thank you though, Cody. This is a great question, well thought out, and I encourage viewers to submit more just like it. You can always find me at investlocalbook.com, which is also a place where you can sign up for my weekly email. I send out an email every Friday with videos just like this. In fact, they're released to my email subscribers 3 days before they're released publicly on all the other platforms on the internet. So if you want to get a sneak peek in advance, you can get one there. And if you're interested in buying a business and avoiding the risk of starting up your own business, then you should be checking out businessbuyeradvantage.com. That's where you're going to find links to all of my videos, books, special reports, and most importantly, the Business Buyer Advantage online course, which is a 9.5-hour program that teaches you how to find, analyze, value, make offers for, do up the paperwork on, finance, etc. A small business that's going to work for you. Anyway, thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.